There are moments in this city quiet, almost invisible, when you realize you're not being heard. Not because you said the wrong thing, but because someone decided you were never meant to speak at all. It doesn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It comes in the form of empty chairs at a meeting you should have been invited to. Memos where your name used to be. Smiles that don't quite reach your eyes anymore. And then one day, someone says something offhand, polished, harmless to everyone else, and it lands on you like a quiet kind of violence. The kind that doesn't bruise your skin, but rearranges your worth. Jasmine Crockett didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just took notes. She smiled through it. But behind that smile was a storm only she knew how to carry. And what she did next made the silence impossible to ignore. It happened on a Tuesday, just another press briefing, in a crowded room where answers were rarely as important as the posture they came in. Caroline Leavitt stood at the White House podium, like she had done dozens of times before. Blue suit, crisp, blonde hair tucked perfectly behind one ear, voice sharp enough to slice through policy and leave only sound bites. A reporter from The Hill asked about the administration's rejection of a new budget proposal co-authored by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, one that aimed to redirect federal infrastructure funding to historically underserved districts. Leavitt didn't even blink. The administration believes in results-driven governance, she said, and some members of Congress are more interested in symbolic fights than tangible impact. We'll let the numbers speak for themselves. The phrase landed like an afterthought. Nothing personal, nothing direct. Just another dismissive phrase, tucked neatly inside a polished political statement. But Jasmine Crockett heard it. From her office on Capitol Hill, the muted television broadcast caught the moment. She didn't flinch, didn't pause her meeting. She simply reached for the small, leather-bound notebook she always kept near her elbow and wrote down one line. Symbolic fight, noted. She didn't need clarification. She knew the tone. She had heard that voice in too many courtrooms before, the one that said, "With all due respect," before denying someone bail because they lived in the wrong zip code. The one that cloaked condescension in neutrality. Crockett closed the notebook and looked back at the budget sheets in front of her. 73 pages of line items, cost analyses, community feedback, and school district data all reduced, in one breath, to symbolic. That word followed her home. It hung in the air as she sat alone that night, reviewing notes from a town hall in East Dallas. One resident had asked, "Do they even see us in D.C.?" Crockett had promised them she would fight for visibility, and she meant it. But that Tuesday, she felt the quiet push of erasure. The kind that didn't scream or shout, but simply stepped over you like you weren't in the room. Caroline Leavitt, the youngest press secretary in modern history, likely didn't intend to target Crockett directly. She probably thought she was speaking broadly, performing the choreography of partisan deflection. But that's what made it more painful, because even without intention, her words carried the full weight of institutional disregard. And it wasn't the first time. In recent weeks, Crockett had noticed small changes. Meeting invites from the White House that used to include her name quietly stopped arriving. A bill she co-sponsored on Medicaid expansion was pulled from a roundtable agenda without notice. When her office inquired, the reply was vague. "We're streamlining for time." Even allies who once forwarded briefings began to go quiet. No hostility, just a slow, invisible retreat. She said nothing, because silence, in Congress, is often mistaken for irrelevance, but in her hands, silence had always been a scalpel. Not everything deserved a reaction. Some things deserved a record. So she kept one. Over the next 2 weeks, Crockett's staff began documenting communications. Every redirection, every passive exclusion, every time her office was left out of a chain that used to loop her in. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern. A pattern that started the moment her budget proposal began gaining traction not just from progressive coalitions, but from moderate districts hungry for visible investments. And Leavitt's comment? That was the first public clue. Crockett had been underestimated before. As a black woman, as a civil rights attorney, as a freshman congresswoman who didn't come from the Ivy League, she didn't look like legacy. She looked like litigation. And Washington didn't always know how to receive that. But she'd learned that power wasn't in the headline, it was in the footnote, the minutes, the phrasing buried inside policy memos. And she was reading carefully. Meanwhile, Caroline Levitt moved on. To her, the line had worked. She dismissed a question without naming names, avoided a policy debate, and reinforced a narrative her base would applaud. Results over rhetoric. She believed she was winning not just the podium, but the story. But what Levitt didn't see, and perhaps never bothered to ask, was how deeply those few words had landed. Jasmine Crockett hadn't built her career on performance. She'd built it in courtrooms and crisis centers, in pro bono cases where real families needed real outcomes. She didn't tweet her outrage, she filed motions. And if Levitt thought calling her symbolic would be the end of it, she was profoundly mistaken. Because Crockett knew what was happening wasn't just about her. She began receiving messages from staffers in other congressional offices, quiet acknowledgments that they too were seeing sudden shifts, last-minute removals from task forces, disappearing invitations. No one could trace it to a single decision. That was the genius of the machine, its plausible deniability. But patterns have a way of exposing themselves, especially when the wrong person starts keeping track. One night, long after the Capitol had emptied, Crockett sat at her desk alone. Outside, the city hummed with indifference, but inside that office, the air was heavy with the beginnings of something. She reread the quote from the transcript of Levitt's briefing, then opened her email and began drafting a request for oversight inquiry. Not a press release, not a social media post. A formal congressional procedure. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was precise. The invisible push that began with one careless phrase was about to meet resistance, not in the form of outrage, but in the form of structure, of process, of law. And Levitt, still basking in the glow of her rising star, hadn't even noticed. For the next several weeks, the silence deepened. It was the kind of silence that didn't come with slamming doors or shouted orders. No one screamed. No one wrote her name on a blacklist. No one called her unfit. They just stopped looking her in the eye. Emails from joint subcommittees that used to arrive every Monday morning no longer came. Invitations to briefings where she was once a recurring speaker now had other names listed, usually someone younger, newer, less disruptive. Even the routine courtesy calls from policy liaisons began to fade, replaced with formal memos and bullet points written as if her district didn't exist beyond paper. And still, Jasmine Crockett smiled. She showed up to every hearing, sat through every markup session, read every amendment line by line, taking notes in that same black leather notebook she'd carried since her days as a trial attorney. She never missed a vote, never showed irritation, never raised her voice. But behind the smile lived a slow accumulation, a weight not measured in policy or procedure, but in memory. In the moments she remembered when people said her presence mattered, and now pretended not to notice when she walked into the room. The political choreography was flawless. No single act could be pointed to as malice. No slur, no overt exclusion, just a quiet agreement to relegate her to the margins. And because she was calm, because she wasn't storming microphones or yelling at press conferences, it was easy to pretend she was fine. They mistook poise for submission. They always did. What they didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett had been through this before, not in Congress, but in deposition rooms, courtroom hallways, and hospital basements where families waited for justice no one thought they'd ever get. This wasn't new to her. It was simply familiar. Still, familiarity didn't make it easier. Each night, after the final vote had been cast and the cameras had turned off, she'd return to her office and sit alone at her desk. The Capitol was different after dark, quieter, older somehow. The wood creaked more. The lights hummed low. And in that stillness, she allowed herself the honesty she couldn't show in daylight. There were moments when she questioned if she was imagining it all. If maybe, just maybe, the silence wasn't intentional. That maybe people were just busy. That the omissions were clerical, not systemic. But every time she tried to believe that, another incident would quietly prove otherwise. A hearing on broadband equity in rural and urban communities, an area she'd led research on, went forward without her inclusion. A press inquiry about voter access reform was redirected to another representative who'd joined the conversation 6 months earlier, and then came the slip-up. An internal email, mistakenly forwarded to her office, exposed the design of it all. It came from a mid-level communications aide at the White House. It was brief, just 3 lines. "Keep Rep. Crockett off the panel. Optics aren't ideal. She's getting too loud again." No curse words. No blatant insult. Just surgical exclusion, couched in strategic language. And in that moment, every quiet moment of erasure clicked into place. She didn't forward the email to the press. She didn't call a news conference. She didn't tweet. She printed it out, highlighted the lines in yellow, and slid it into a manila folder already thick with documentation, calendar changes, revised talking points, skipped invitations, and transcripts. A record of subtle erasure, built day by day. Her staff had begun to notice too. Meetings that once had 10 confirmations now returned with 3. Her communications director flagged multiple media requests that had gone missing, not rejected, but vanished before even reaching their inbox. "They're freezing us out," one aide said in frustration. Crockett only nodded. "I know. That's why we keep showing up." Because she understood something fundamental. Systems don't fall from being yelled at. They shift when you quietly expose their patterns slowly, publicly, without blinking. So she kept showing up, kept voting, kept speaking. Her voice never cracked, her hands never shook, but the weight, the cumulative pressure of being both visible and invisible never left her. It followed her home. She stopped checking social media after work, stopped attending receptions. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages of vague support. "We're with you," or "hang in there," from people too afraid to speak out themselves. Even in private, many refused to acknowledge what was happening. One senior colleague told her over lunch, "Don't take it personally, Jasmine. It's just strategy." She smiled, and when he left the table, she wrote down that line in her notebook. "Don't take it personally." The phrase echoed in her mind that evening as she sat by the window of her apartment, the city lights of Washington stretching far and wide below. She remembered a woman in East Texas who once told her, "Silence is the first layer of forgetting. They stop listening, and then they stop seeing." She wouldn't let them forget her, not by screaming, not by storming rooms, but by documenting, by staying still long enough for the silence to become deafening. And in that stillness, she began planning her pivot. It would begin not with a lawsuit, not with a press campaign, but with a congressional oversight inquiry into budget transparency and committee representation, dry on the surface, but explosive in implication. She would call for records, official records of decision-making on which proposals were elevated and which were shelved. She would force the system to account for its silence. Because silence, when recorded, becomes data. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a woman with a notebook anymore. She was a congresswoman with a pattern, and patterns had power. She told no one of her full plan. She didn't need to. Her staff followed her lead, steady, composed, relentless. They began cross-referencing briefings, flagging omissions, mapping which offices stopped including them and when. It wasn't about catching anyone red-handed. It was about creating a map of subtle power shifts and how a single voice could be redirected out of relevance. Crockett had once won a $1 million settlement for a nurse who was demoted after speaking out about medical negligence. That case, like this one, had no shouting. Just paper trails, cross-examinations, and the slow unraveling of a story the institution didn't want told. She was walking that same path again. And still, she smiled. Because the weight behind her smile wasn't weakness. It was memory. It was calculation. It was the knowledge that justice doesn't always come quickly, but it always arrives eventually, when someone is patient enough to prepare the ground. And in Washington, D.C., where optics were often louder than truth, she was learning to make quiet look like strength. It started with a question that wasn't meant to be historic. The House Oversight Committee had convened a hearing to review the federal budget reallocation proposals for the upcoming fiscal year. The topic was dry, the atmosphere tense but routine. Most members arrived with talking points. Some didn't even bother staying past the opening statements. Budget hearings were rarely dramatic. That morning was supposed to be no different. Then came the moment, the kind that doesn't announce itself with thunder but shifts the entire room with a glance. Senator Roland Bishop, a senior conservative known for his disdain for what he often called performative equity, leaned forward into his microphone. The room, half empty and half asleep, barely registered at first. "I'd like to raise a concern," he began, glancing briefly at a stack of papers. Congresswoman Crockett's proposal to allocate $125 million to restore infrastructure in her district seems driven less by economic priority and more by what I would term identity-based motivation. The air flattened. He continued, "We have to ask ourselves, are we budgeting based on merit, or are we chasing symbolic wins to satisfy ideological narratives?" No one spoke for a full 10 seconds. Not the chair, not the staffers, not even the interns scribbling notes in the corner. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She waited. Then, calmly, she lifted a single binder and laid it flat on the table before her. She opened to a bookmarked page and spoke not to Bishop, but to the room. "This is a breakdown of bridge maintenance schedules in my district, compared with those in Senator Bishop's home state. You'll find that in 17 of the 23 areas we've requested funding for, the infrastructure is classified as at-risk or structurally deficient by the Department of Transportation. These aren't symbolic roads. These are collapsing ones." There was no anger in her tone, no raise in pitch, just facts clear, unmoved by insinuation. Then she turned a second page. "And this," she said, tapping her finger to the document, "is an internal memo from the Office of Budget Strategy dated 2 weeks before my proposal was denied its scheduled hearing. In it, we find language suggesting a directive to, and I quote, streamline review of policy items originating from high-risk narrative zones." That language was used to flag urban districts with high minority representation. I know because I asked. There was no mistaking what was happening now. The curtain, the one that protected institutional decisions with bureaucratic language and ambiguous phrasing, had slipped. Reporters in the room perked up. Phones started recording. Not because she was yelling, but because she wasn't. Crockett then looked directly across the aisle at the committee chair. "I'm asking for this hearing to include a review of decision-making criteria used in the selection of priority funding. If the decisions are neutral, the data will show it. If not, we need to talk about why." The chair, caught between parliamentary neutrality and political consequence, hesitated. Then he nodded. "You have the floor. Submit your request for expanded inquiry." That was all she needed. Across town, in a starkly lit press room, Caroline Levitt watched the clip play out on cable news. She hadn't planned to comment that day, but now the headlines were shifting. And her name, buried in footnotes and scheduling chains, was starting to emerge in sentences like communications memos traced to the White House and internal language originating from executive press offices. She reached for her phone, opened the staff text thread, and typed a single message: "We need to manage this narrative." But the narrative was already slipping from her hands. Because 2 days after the hearing, a quiet leak made its way to Politico. It was an email, not from Crockett, not from a whistleblower, from Caroline Levitt herself. Dated 8 weeks earlier, it was addressed to a senior communications aide and read, "Be cautious on Crockett's media elevation. The administration doesn't benefit from platforming grievance-driven messaging. Keep her out of long-format briefings. Optics are unpredictable." That sentence didn't scream. It didn't insult. It was calm, calculated, and cold. And it was exactly what Crockett had been documenting for months, the architecture of invisibility. Within hours, Crockett's office released a short statement. "We have seen the memo. We will address it through official process. We continue to believe that silence is not neutrality. It's complicity. She didn't call for Levitt's resignation. She didn't call it racist. She didn't label it unethical. She just called it visible. The White House refused to comment on the leak, calling it unverified internal correspondence. But fact-checkers confirmed the header information and email routing codes. It was real. And it wasn't an isolated message. Suddenly, journalists who had dismissed Crockett's claims as exaggerated began digging. What they found wasn't fire, not yet, but smoke. A chain of strategic communications suggesting subtle efforts to reduce the visibility of certain lawmakers under the justification of narrative discipline. In one internal document, the phrase racial tension fatigue appeared next to the names of lawmakers whose proposals were flagged as politically volatile. Levitt, still assuming control, called for a press conference. She stood behind the podium, the one that gave her power, the one where her words had once sliced through controversy with confidence, and delivered a short statement. There has been no targeted suppression. Communications strategy involves prioritization, not censorship. We welcome robust debate, but we also need to manage distraction. It sounded clean, precise, and completely devoid of acknowledgement. Crockett didn't respond in kind. She didn't hold a counterconference. She didn't flood the news cycle. She simply requested a special review hearing to be scheduled within 3 weeks, calling for the production of all internal executive communications related to committee coordination and congressional representation visibility. The House Rules Committee granted it. It was the first time in 8 years that a communications review had been authorized against the executive office without prior bipartisan agreement. And for the first time, Caroline Levitt received a formal request to testify under oath. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't a political ambush. It was procedure. Quiet, legal, devastating. As Levitt read the subpoena, her aide leaned in and asked, "Should we ignore this?" Levitt didn't answer, because she knew something had changed. The face she once dismissed as symbolic was now the voice behind the first crack in her carefully curated platform, not through outrage, not through spectacle, but through undeniable procedural force. And the curtain had slipped. The chamber was quieter than usual. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was the awareness that something was about to happen that couldn't be stopped, not by rhetoric, not by rank, not even by routine. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Jasmine Crockett walked into room 226 of the Rayburn House office building, the room reserved for high-profile oversight hearings. She wore dark navy, no jewelry. Her hair was pulled back tightly. No press, no entourage, just a binder in one hand and a yellow legal pad in the other. Caroline Levitt arrived 15 minutes later. She looked the same as she always had, polished, confident, collected. But there was a tremor in her hand that her staff tried not to notice. She took her seat across from Crockett with a small glass of water, untouched. Her legal advisor sat to her right. There was no podium this time, no cameras flanking her angles. Just a microphone and a nameplate. The chair opened the session. The room was filled with congressional aides, legal advisors, press observers, and more than a dozen members from both parties. Some were there out of curiosity, some out of obligation, but all knew this wasn't just another procedural review. This was the first time a sitting White House press secretary had been asked to publicly account for the internal mechanics of political narrative management under oath. The chair turned to Crockett. "You have the floor." Crockett didn't rise. She simply adjusted her microphone and spoke. "Ms. Levitt," she began, her voice steady but measured, "you've stated that communication strategy involves prioritization, not censorship. I'd like to walk through some of that prioritization today." Levitt nodded. "Of course." Crockett opened her binder. On April 4th, a memo from your office labeled the proposal for the Infrastructure Equity Initiative as narratively sensitive. Can you explain what that meant? Levitt cleared her throat. "We categorize proposals based on their media implications. Sensitive proposals often involve high emotion or partisan framing. And who determines what constitutes high emotion. Our communications team, guided by myself. Crockett didn't react. She simply slid a copy of the memo across the table. On page 2, your team wrote, avoid elevating urban redevelopment proposals from narrative-driven districts. Optics unpredictable. May activate grievance framing. Was this referring to my district? I don't recall the specific district that note referenced. Crockett turned another page. There is an attachment with my proposal attached directly beneath that comment. The room held its breath. Crockett continued, her voice razor-sharp but never raised. I'd like to move to another entry, an email dated March 2020, in which you advised a policy director to, quote, loop in moderate allies only. Crockett's proposal's too noisy, and her profile's growing too fast. Do you remember writing that? Levitt blinked, slowly. I'd have to see the email in context. Crockett handed her a printed copy. You wrote it at 7:12 a.m. The subject line was, Managing Exposure. The attachment was a press schedule, with my name removed. The paper shook in Levitt's hand. I don't deny writing it, she finally said. But it wasn't about silencing. It was about protecting message discipline. Crockett leaned in, not confrontational, but precise. Who gets protected, Miss Levitt? And who gets deleted? No answer. Crockett let the silence linger. Then she turned the page again. We've found 7 distinct references across your team's communications labeling certain representatives as symbolic pressure points. All 7 were women of color. Were those just optics, too? At this, Levitt's legal advisor reached for the microphone, but Crockett raised her hand calmly. No need. I'm not assigning intent. I'm asking about language. Because language, in your role, isn't passive. It directs. It guides. It excludes. She paused, then pulled a final page from her binder. This document, she said, holding it up, is not an email. It's a transcript from a closed-door strategy meeting dated February 17th. You said, and I quote, if Crockett gets national traction, we lose the high ground on equity. She turns data into emotion. That's dangerous. The words hung in the air like smoke. Levitt's face stiffened. That transcript wasn't authorized. But the words are yours, Crockett asked. Silence. Yes, Levitt finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, no one moved. And then, softly, Crockett closed her binder and folded her hands. I want to be clear, she said. This isn't about punishing you. This isn't about partisanship. This is about a system, a culture that confuses discomfort with disruption and disruption with danger. I don't need a spotlight, Miss Levitt. I need a seat at the table I was elected to occupy. She turned to the chair. I yield my time. The room didn't erupt. No one clapped. There was no need. The weight of her words didn't ask for applause, only acknowledgement. Levitt looked down at her notes, but they no longer mattered. Because in the end, it wasn't Crockett's anger that wounded her. It was her clarity. There had been no accusations, no yelling, no outrage. Just a scalpel made of words, wielded by a woman who had waited patiently, watched quietly, and now in front of the very institution that had tried to erase her, delivered a lesson no one could dismiss. Levitt had once called Crockett symbolic. Now the symbol had spoken, and it cut deeper than Levitt ever imagined. Caroline Levitt didn't resign. Not immediately. She returned to the West Wing the next morning, stepping into the press office like nothing had changed. Her team smiled weakly, avoided eye contact. The coffee was still warm, the briefing still stacked neatly in folders, but the air felt thinner, like the oxygen had been partially turned off. Reporters no longer asked about border policy or international trade. Every question that week started with 2 words, about Crockett. And for the first time, Levitt had no prepared answer. She tried to reframe the hearing as a procedural misunderstanding, tried to dismiss it as a political trap. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became the damage wasn't in what Crockett had said. It was in what Levitt couldn't. Because her words, the emails, the memos, the offhand remarks now transcribed weren't just missteps. They were design. And now, the country had seen them. Within days, the White House faced mounting pressure to respond formally. Staff meetings turned tense. Internal debates flared. Some pushed for Leavitt to apologize. Others wanted to ride out the news cycle and let it die. But it didn't die. Because Crockett didn't let it. She didn't gloat, didn't hold celebratory interviews or draft victory tweets. She simply showed up to the House floor, to town halls, to interviews on Sunday morning shows, and kept repeating one line. This was never about me. It's about who gets heard, and who gets filtered out before they even speak. That sentence, clipped and repeated across platforms, became something more than commentary. It became a warning and a mirror. Editorials began calling it a watershed moment for political communications. Op-eds dissected the implications of narrative management. Law schools hosted panels about representational erasure in administrative structures. University students began quoting the hearing in term papers and debate clubs. But the most powerful echo came from within Leavitt's own ranks. A mid-level staffer, a young woman who had worked beside Leavitt since the beginning, quietly handed in her resignation. "I didn't sign up to manage voices out of the room," her letter read. "That's not communications. That's erasure." The resignation leaked. It made headlines. And suddenly, it wasn't just Crockett's voice demanding accountability. It was former allies, staffers, constituents. Even some of the same media figures who once hailed Leavitt as a prodigy were now publicly reassessing their early praise. Tucker Carlson aired a segment titled, "When Strategy Becomes Suppression." Meghan McCain tweeted, "Diversity doesn't threaten the message. It completes it." Ben Shapiro, who had once referred to Leavitt as the most disciplined voice in the conservative revival, wrote a column asking, "What happens when discipline becomes denial?" Even Trump, who had been notably silent, reportedly told aides in private that the situation was a distraction, the kind he no longer had time for. And still, Leavitt did not resign. Until the echo got louder. At 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, an anonymous source leaked a second transcript, this time from a strategy call in which Leavitt had referred to Crockett's community work as optics bait and suggested offhand that letting her into the spotlight would just feed the grievance machine. The line hit harder than the first hearing, not because it was more offensive, but because it was clearer. There was no plausible deniability left, only intent. The next morning, Crockett walked past the Capitol Rotunda with her usual quiet stride. Her aides handed her a printed copy of Leavitt's newly announced resignation letter. It was short, clinical. "While I maintain that my actions were within the bounds of my duties, I recognize that the perception and interpretation of internal communication can carry a weight of their own. In the interest of restoring full focus to the administration's mission, I am stepping down as press secretary, effective immediately. No apology, no acknowledgement of harm, just a withdrawal, clean, sterile, unrepentant." Crockett read the letter once, folded it. That evening, she gave no speech, no gloating post, no "told you so" segment. Instead, she attended a small community event in South Dallas, a literacy program she'd helped fund 3 years prior. No cameras, no headlines, just parents and children reading under warm fluorescent lights. A journalist caught up with her outside. "Do you feel vindicated?" they asked. She paused. "No, I feel seen." That quote became the headline, and it stuck. Because America, or at least the version of it that watched, had finally seen the mechanics of marginalization laid bare, not by protest or scandal, but by patience, by precision, by proof. And as the days passed, something shifted. Across the country, staffers in state houses and local governments began raising questions about who got included in policy briefings. Advocacy groups began demanding access to communication logs. Young interns in congressional offices began whispering about doing a Crockett not in protest, but in procedure. Even the House Oversight Committee quietly adopted new rules requiring transparency in the inclusion process for inter-office coordination. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was real. The echo had started to reshape the walls. For Caroline Levitt, the fallout lingered. Without her title, the job offers slowed. Legal inquiries began circling. Her professional circle shrank. Her speaking engagements were canceled, then forgotten. Conservative donors who once praised her insight now ignored her calls. In the quiet of her apartment, she replayed Crockett's words from the hearing again and again. Who gets protected, Miss Levitt, and who gets deleted? She tried to forget them, but she couldn't, because some words don't bruise, they stain. And the stain on her reputation wasn't scandalous. It was structural. She hadn't screamed at anyone. She hadn't thrown slurs. She hadn't ranted. She'd just erased someone, carefully, quietly, and the world had watched her get caught. Years later, the story still lived not as a headline, but as a case study. In classrooms, in HR training modules, in communications departments across government and media. And always, it came back to that one woman sitting across the table, binder in hand, smile on her face, and truth on her tongue. Jasmine Crockett. She didn't destroy her opponent. She simply showed the country what was already there and asked them to decide if they could still look away. They couldn't. And that was the real victory. Sometimes, the most powerful voices aren't the ones that shout, but the ones that wait, prepare, and then speak when the room is finally ready to hear them. Have you ever been in that room? Have you ever watched a door close quietly, not because of your mistakes, but because someone else couldn't handle your presence? Have you ever smiled through erasure, taken notes while being overlooked, and asked yourself whether your silence was strength or survival? If you have, then you already know. This story wasn't just about politics. It was about dignity, about choosing not to become bitter, but becoming sharper, about fighting not with anger, but with alignment between who you are and what you're willing to stand for. Let this remind you, your presence is not a problem to solve. It's a truth to respect. You don't have to raise your voice to matter. Sometimes, just showing up again and again is the most radical act of all. If this story touched something in you, I invite you to subscribe, leave a comment below, and tell us what moments of quiet courage you've had to live through. And if someone you love has ever felt invisible in a room they deserve to be in, please share this episode with them. Let them know they're not alone. Because sometimes, the echo we leave behind is louder than the voice they tried to silence. See you in the next story. Stay tuned.